Welcome. Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Mary Miller, Director of the Getty Research Institute, and I'm so happy to have you all here together this afternoon in the Harold M. Williams Auditorium. It's named for the founding president of the Getty, Harold Williams, and who challenged his teams of the 1980s and 90s, and by extension to all of Getty today, to do what no other arts organization could do. Williams and his colleagues of those years, Kurt Forster, Nancy Englander, John Walsh, Deborah Marrow, Miguel Angel Corso, among others, set out to shape an institution that would be like no other in Southern California or in the United States, or honestly, in the world. But we engaged this afternoon with another Angelino project that pushed expectations of and in California. In 1966, putting aside his life as an accountant, Sidney B. Felsen co-founded Gemini G.E.L, the Los Angeles publisher of limited edition prints and sculpture, with Stanley Grinstein and master printer Kenneth Tyler, and together with Rosamund Felsen and Elise Grinstein. First came a friendship. Sidney B. Felsen and the artists at Gemini G.E.L celebrates Felsen's rich photographic record of the workshop through Gemini's history. For over 5 decades, Sidney captured the life of the workshop through his photographs, documenting creative collaborations among artists, printers, and fabricators. Felsen's photographs equally record the many close friendships fostered with the artists who collaborated at Gemini and who bore witness and bear witness to the evolving Los Angeles art scene. As you will see today, it is a living, organic process. Gemini has championed the limits of printmaking. Please go see the exhibition if you have not, or perhaps after this talk, go see it again across the way. It'll be open until 8 p.m. tonight to discover some of the 70 artists and the work of 155 printers. Okay, not all of them, but many. These are numbers that continue to grow today in the studio, still led by the Felsen and Grinstein families. At the heart of this exhibition is the Sidney B. Felsen Photography Archive, which was generously donated to the Getty Research Institute in 2019 by Jack Shear. Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Sidney. And many thanks as well to Jordan Schnitzer and to the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, which have provided major support for the exhibition. I thank public programming at Getty, particularly the GRI staff and Trust Comm staff who are here today, Trust Development. Thank you so much for coming inside and making this all work on this beautiful afternoon. And although they're not here to hear our thanks, I want to thank the Bon Appetit staff who'll be putting on a lovely reception for us after the program. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers this afternoon. Naoko Takahatake, curator of our exhibition, First Came a Friendship, served as a Getty curator for 4 years and who worked intensively with Gemini G.E.L for many years before that during her tenure at LACMA. She is director and chief curator of the Grunwald Center of the Hammer Museum. Naoko is in conversation today with artist Julie Mehretu. Julie Mehretu is a world-renowned painter born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1970, and who lives and works today in New York City and Berlin. She received a Master's of Fine Arts with honors from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1997. Mehretu is a recipient of many awards, including the MacArthur Award in 2005 and the U.S. Department of State Medal of Arts Award in 2015. named one of Time magazine's most influential people in 2020. She has also been named BMW's 20th Art Car Artist of this very year in 2024. She has shown her work extensively in international and domestic solo and group exhibitions and is represented in public and private collections around the world. Mehretu's global representative is Marion Goodman Gallery, New York, Los Angeles, and Paris. And Mehretu also shows with White Cube, London, and with Carlier Gebauer in Berlin. Her latest solo exhibition, Ensemble, is currently on view at the Palazzo Grassi in Venice. Julie, Naoko, welcome.
Hi, Julie. Thank you all for being here today. Yeah. It's a distinct pleasure to be sharing this hour with Julie Mehretu, distinguished figure in the contemporary practice of painting, and indeed in printmaking. Mehretu's large-scale, layered, abstract compositions explore and interrogate a multiplicity of histories and narratives and engage the most pressing conditions of our moment, from migration, displacement, and diaspora, to colonialism, geopolitics, protest, revolution and war, and climate change. Her works are monumental, not just in their scale, but in their conceptual ambition, intellectual scope, and formal achievement. Through an accretion of strokes, lines, daubs, sprays, erasures, and digital interventions, Mehretu creates palimpsests of time and space that can be animated by a vibrant choreography of color or resolutely monochrome. While the built landscape and the figure subtend and surface from her compositions, Mehretu's pictorial language is insistently abstract. Abstraction as a political gesture, and in her words, as a liberatory practice. She continuously reimagines this abstraction, creating an ever-evolving lexicon of visual neologisms. Her marks the signifiers for collective memories, emergent ideas, and future contingents. Mehretu's works pulse with a vitality that speak to the dynamic movements of her thoughts, the energy and breadth of her prodigious mind, and incisive critical thinking. Julie, thank you for sharing this moment with me here at the Getty today.
Thank you so much, and Naoko, congratulations on this exhibition. It's so moving to go through the exhibition the way it's laid out and to see all these forms. It be in the conversation with all these other artists, but see the form of what Gemini has actually done and be able to see that kind of the testament to that is amazing. So.
Well, thank you for your and thank you for your participation and your support. It really was a true pleasure to be able to work on this project. So I'd like to start by situating printmaking within your creative practice. You came to printmaking as a student in art school and have been making prints throughout your career. And you have remarked that, quote, "It is in printmaking that new things are invented, which I then want to bring into the painting and drawing." Can you talk a little bit about the way in which printmaking has evolved with painting, but also challenged and pushed your painting practice?
Yeah, I was actually brought to printmaking by force because the painting program at Rhode Island School of Design at that time was a painting printmaking program. And only one of the graduate students in our course in our class was a printmaker. The rest of us were painters. So we all had to take like Intaglio 101, right? Basically for graduate students, this printmaking course. And we all resented it. We were so angry that we had to, when you're a kid, you think you know so much and you know what you're doing and you know nothing about what you're doing and you're trying, you have these ideas of what it means to make something. But it was actually the most, like, the most illuminating kind of course that we did, and the practice, I got so taken by it, and I think a lot of it is because of the process, and because you're learning through that process. It's not like when I was a much younger student learning how to paint, and learning how to even work with paint. I mean, and I really didn't know as much as I thought I knew. And what was so interesting in the process of working with intaglio and process of working with plates is that through that process, new things could happen. Like, I didn't have the pressure of trying to create a real artwork because I was working in this forced medium that I didn't really, so I just got lost in how to do it properly. And in that process, that was actually where I started to really make the marks very tiny, because you could only work with a needle. Like, that was the easiest way to make a print at the time. Hard ground and a needle was the first step you did before aqua tints and everything else. So that's where I started to work with these very fine line marks, these very tiny marks, my earliest marks, and that really changed everything in my painting. And so printmaking it became this thing that became fundamental and instrumental to building this language, this visual language that I worked with now for 20-something years, and that came through, that study. So from that point, I think I've always, like, I just got lost, and I fell in love with it as a way of working, because because the process is so kind of engaging, and so many things you can experiment in it in a very different way than you can in painting. Painting is more immediate, but it's an additive, or you can erase something or paint over it, but it's not something you can take the same thing and do it in different colors, and you can't change the layering of something in the same way that you can with printmaking. So this malleable kind of way of working became really important, and then new things started to always happen in the prints, and they always preceded the paintings. Like, the paintings kind of always followed the prints in a way. And there was a publisher I worked with very young. One of the gallerists I worked with, the director of the gallery, wanted me to do a project with Greg Burnett and publish an edition with Writing House Press. And he said, all along, the prints can kind of grow with you as you work and as you paint. And something about that stuck in me, and I really loved this idea of being able to do this other project that's outside of my own studio in collaboration with a printmaker and a master printer and a press, and being able to get to do that. Something else happens in that space. And so over the years, it's just been something that I've been fortunate enough to do, and I've had the great fortune of working with such great printers and such great people, and it's been amazing.
I want to talk a little bit about intaglio specifically, because your commitment to printmaking has been in intaglio. And just for our audiences, when we're talking about intaglio printmaking, we're talking about prints that are made printing from metal matrices or printing matrices or elements, typically copper, and the marks are made by removing or displacing the metal. So that can be manually through drypoint, or through etching, where it is the acid that is doing the act of moving the metal. And then you're inking the plates. The ink that is going to print sits in the incised marks on the plate and is printed under a lot of pressure. So there are terms that come up here when we talk about intaglio: the excavation of lines in drypoint. There is the painterly application of spit bite, which you see here. You have also worked with spraying resist, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why intaglio. I think there are two ways to think about this. One is really the distinct graphic vocabulary that is particular to intaglio printmaking, the way the ink sits on the surface of the page. But I think there's also the physical process of you working in intaglio that might be something that draws you to it.
Yeah, it's both. It's intaglio has this, it was the first. I don't know, somehow it seduced me, the copper, working on copper and working with copper plates, and those were the first plates I worked with. There's a physicality. When I would go to the print library at Rhode Island School of Design, I would go to you could ask them to pull prints, and you could study the prints, and we did that together at the Hammer, which was such a highlight. But when you're able to do that as a student, the prints that I was most drawn to were intaglios, and were like etchings, and they were it was because I think they have a physicality to them. They're almost like sculptural somehow. They have this something that I feel like doesn't necessarily happen with lithography or doesn't happen with, screen print has that in a very different way. It's this additive kind of thing, and you can actually build that up. But somehow the intaglio it goes through the press with so much pressure, the wet paper and the copper, that it actually embosses into the plate, the marks. But then also you always sense that somehow. Whereas on a lithostone, it's just right on the surface, even if it's graphite, looks like a most intense drawing. When you come up close to it, it's very, very flat. So something about that, it really, like the way that the prints looked, really, I was seduced by that. But I was also, the process of working in the plate, since it was something that I learned, and it just gets more, you can get so detailed, and it can go on and on and on. And I was looking recently, I was working at Gemini this past week, and looking at a really incredible Tobacadori mezzotint print that she just did. And it's astonishing. Like, you can work on prints only for your whole life, and still there's so much to learn and do. And I think that's the challenge of that. And for me, it's also what is possible in that. I've had the real, like I said, an amazing fortune to work with such great master printers. And Case Hudson, who's here today from Gemini, is the one I've worked with forever here with Gemini since the beginning, since I think 2007 or 8. And I never thought I could do, when I started working with prints, I never thought I'd be sitting on the ground doing a dry point painting, spit bite like this, where you're painting with the acid on an aqua tinted plate, and a plate that has been given some form of very, very fine resist, and you paint on that with the acid, and it creates this kind of, beautiful watercolor kind of mark. But then you can do that mark in any color you want, or you can totally not ink it at all. Like, it's very malleable, and there's something, and then you can also totally erase the mark. Like, you can build this patina into the plate. And something about working in reverse in printmaking, in intaglio, having to work in reverse, and having to, and what happens in that kind of space where intuition has to really guide the way that I work. It kind of all is about this form that is very seductive.
You're working in reverse, but we'll see a slide at the very end of this conversation. But you're also spraying resists in black, which are actually going to print in reserve. So you're also thinking positive and negative, the black and the white kind of
Yes.
being in opposition to each other. You talked about a lifetime of learning in printmaking. You are always in dialogue with artists of the past, your contemporaries as well, and artists of the near past. And we'll return to that in terms of thinking about collaboration and your creative thought partners. But I know that one of your artistic touchstones historically has been Rembrandt, both in terms of painting and printmaking, Rembrandt being an artist who similarly was devoted entirely to intaglio printmaking. Do you want to just say a few words before we move on to your printmaking at Gemini about Rembrandt?
Sure. I mean, so Rembrandt, being able to study Rembrandt prints is one of the most, it's something I adored, and it's just thrilling to be able to see these in person and to study them without frames up close, to be able to really look at them with a loupe. Incredible what he could do. And from my understanding, this was all before aqua tints, and the kind of range that Rembrandt could get with these marks in copper by just making these little lines and etching copper or dry point. Those were the two ways that he could really affect the plate. And he does so much and is able to get such a variety, from the tiniest little leaves and the flutter in the sky to like the intense dark marks you see around the lion's mane there. And then there's always something a little funny in the prints, like what's happening with the couple there. There's always some kind of little narrative that kind of is always captivating, or her hand inside her robe while she's reading, very sensual. And I think for me in painting, Rembrandt's eyes are what capture me, right? And the kind of abstraction in the mark making, and the vulnerability of what it means to be here and means to be human. And he really captures that essence so incredibly it just has always moved me. In fact, the first painting was ever really moved by was a Rembrandt painting of Isaac being sacrificed just before, the sacrifice of Isaac, and he's just about to have his head cut off when the angel comes and holds the sword back of Abraham's hand. It's Abraham, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure I'm getting these names right. But Abraham, and that painting I saw in a book, and I just remember it was in one of my mother's Rembrandt books, and being so moved by that. And that still is what happened with me then with printmaking, like not just contemporary printmakers, but being able to like go back and study printmakers, painters who were involved in this work as a way of like understanding. Like really, it's an investigation. It's not just this effort of making. And the number of states, when you start to really study the prints, you can see them in these various states, and how he would then build more and more of these, be able to get the darks and the lights and be able to really push that in the print, that kind of contrast. So I don't know, I was inspired by him and of course Goya and others that we've been looking at for so long, and in addition to a lot of the contemporary printmakers. But I think for me, it was like easier to start with the mark, and because of that, that's one of the reasons Rembrandt became so important to me, because so many of the contemporary printmakers were working with more complicated ways of making marks, like spit bite or other forms of aqua tinting that I always had trouble with in the print studio. It was harder for me to get an interesting image that way.
And I think when you really look at the Rembrandt etchings and drypoint up close, he's developing a very personal language, this distinctive graphic vocabulary of very active marks, very refined, complex marks that I think, I see also in your work of developing this very personal language of mark making. Let's talk about Gemini. I'm just, for our audience, I'm going to give a little bit of background on Gemini. Gemini, as Mary mentioned, was founded in 1966 here in Los Angeles. It's an artist workshop and publisher of limited edition prints and sculpture. Some of the early artists Gemini worked with included, and you can see them represented in the exhibition, Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Ellsworth Kelly, Roy Lichtenstein, Klaus Oldenburg, Richard Serra. Other artists include Via Selman, Anne Hamilton, and the more recent generation, Julie Mehretu, Tacita Dean, Toba Kadori, and Analia Saban. So there are more, some 70 artists who have worked at Gemini over the years. And from its inception, Gemini has really championed technical innovation and providing artists with the means to produce groundbreaking work. And that includes scale, which is important when we talk about Julie's work, and really establishing this reputation for fostering a spirit of collaboration. Importantly, when thinking about Gemini and the history and the rise of printmaking in the 1960s, was the booster, Rauschenberg's booster, which was made in Gemini's second year. And at the time, it was the largest hand-pulled lithograph ever made. And this was really heralded a shift in printmaking, where prints could rival the scale and visual impact of painting. And I think you've really continued that tradition. But here we're looking at something quite small. Actually, this was your first Gemini print, which was 2008. You contributed to a portfolio, which was the Artist for Obama portfolio, and you've gone on to make 17 prints at Gemini since then. I would like to just focus on a few key projects and along the way touch on a few themes, including scale, collaboration, the history of Gemini artists, and Los Angeles. But before I turn to the first project, I would just like to read Sidney Felsen's words about you at Gemini. And this is Sidney. Around the turn of this century, there was a belief that young artists were not interested in printmaking. Then came the magical moment when Julie appeared in our lives, this 36-year-old who was seriously interested in printmaking. She reminded me of some earlier artists at Gemini who were major printmakers. Some artists will be shown what to do, and they do it. But Julie is one of those persons who wants to know about it and what's underneath it. both your painting and printmaking are noted for their scale, which implicate the viewer in this somatic experience. You talk about it as this time-based experience of viewing your work, of being immersed. I also think of the experience of making your prints being very time-based, especially when it comes to printmaking. Some of your kind of proofing with Gemini has gone on for years. It's an iterative process where you come, you do your work, you walk away from it, you come back to it, and I imagine see things with fresh eyes as well. And so I've heard you talk about scale also being time. So if you would talk a little bit about how that comes together in your printmaking and specifically at Gemini.
Well, because of the history of printmakers and so many of the contemporary prints that I was studying as a student were prints that were produced by Gemini, for example, or published by Gemini and printed by the press. And I think so. I remember looking at different John's prints that were super moving and Rauschenberg prints, and this work that these were the giants of contemporary art that we were growing up looking at. So when I first came, after we did with Case and I did the small Obama etching, drypoint, we decided I came here and we went out to the ocean to get some inspiration on scale, and we spent the first day really at the beach and at the ocean on a long walk, and we talked about how, and it was there that we talked about maybe being able to do this kind of paint and etching this at this scale, but with like in these parts, like as a grid. But the reason I wanted to do something of that scale was because it was Gemini and it could be possible. Like, so the prints that I had made with Greg Burnett before that were very small. Crown Point, the prints were also about this scale. But at Gemini, there was this limitless capability of being able to work, and that was coming directly from Sidney. Sidney has this commitment to pushing you to go as far as you can and to do what you can, and giving the printers the capability to get the materials that they need. So after this project, for example, Case bought a new press so we could work on much bigger projects, because this print was printed on a smaller press, and that's the reason the pieces of paper were a little smaller, but it's still, I think, one of the largest we've done. So it was remarkable, the amount of copper that we used to make this, the amount, so a lot of the other places that I worked, you had to be much more, there's a restraint because of the expense of copper, the kind of how much time and energy it takes to actually put plates of that scale into the aquatint baths, into acid baths, into whatever, into the aquatint box. So take all of this, there's so much technical process that goes into doing something at this scale. So when that was a possibility, I wanted to push that envelope, and Case was right there. Case was right there to do it, and so we went to the ocean, and you know from being in Los Angeles what the ocean does to you, and what that vista does to you, and the scale of that, and the light, and the air, and the wind, and I started this print. Actually, my partner was just starting. We were just starting my partner at the time, IVF for our second son. So this print and that. My child were made at the same time. And actually, the day that this print opened in New York in a show was the day that Kylie came into the world. It's kind of wild. But this was the beginning of our program, and it's like almost 14 years ago that we started working on this. I would work on layers of Mylar where I would draw, and then Case with the team would find ways to get that etched into copper in a kind of sugar lift, like a more a different type of sugar lift process, a more light-based sugar lift process, and we were able to work with that. And so what they could do, what Case could do, was just amazing. And that's what happens when you're working with an incredible master printer. It's like I compare it to a musician going to a different producer studio and coming in with and hearing a bunch of beats and hearing a bunch of sounds, and then starting to come up with a song. And you've seen that film of Jay-Z in Rick Rubin's studio or whatever it was, and he just starts to get this vibe, and then the rhyme comes. There's something like that to working with these different printers, because when you working with Case, it's so expansive, and what I could do was something that I had never been able to do before, and then I was able to bring color into that, and that's where new things started to happen on the white paper, in the black mark, and the blackness of the mark, and then what I could do with the color, and then that started to shift the paintings. That's when I started to bring color then into the paintings. So it's this interesting relationship in terms of that, but also in terms of physically what's possible, and that is Sidney really set this place up by taking really good care of you as an artist, really good care of the people that work with him, and this beautiful atmosphere. You go into the press, and there are photographs of everyone who's worked there. All his photographs that you have here in the exhibition are lined. His entire office is completely covered in these photographs, and he's immersed in this out of a love of the work, a love of the process, a love of the people, and you can feel that. And there's something so generative about that. I feel so blessed and grateful that I had the opportunity and got the invitation, and it's just opened up worlds for me in terms of what I could do with painting. And I don't think my painting would be where it was without this process.
I just want to make a comment about the printmaking preceding the painting, because this was a realization I came to as I was looking through your work and looking at sort of monographs and looking at the dates and seeing that it didn't quite line up. And I thought, well, what is Julie saying? Because the prints are actually dated after the paintings. How is that precedence? And then when I came to the realization that the editioning process might take 2 years, and so really as the ideas were coming to form, as these sort of ideas, concepts, and were coming to form in printmaking, they didn't actually come to the world and circulate into the world until possibly 2-3 years later, just because the printers had to catch up with you. So the paintings were then, coming out a little more quickly. So that, and I think that's a good moment to switch to Bardos, which was your next very large project. To my eye, this body of work really beautifully captures your work conceptually and formally. So in Buddhist thought, the bardo is the liminal state between death and rebirth. It evokes a transitional condition, a conversion, like the time-based experience of viewing your work. Marks and forms emerge from, hover over, and fade into atmospheric hazes. Layers of colors blend and shift, calling forth cave painting, calligraphy, graffiti, and traditions of abstract painting. Your visual language of gestural strokes, pixels, sprays, and blurs collapses time, connecting past to future. With 6 bardos, you press printmaking even further. And for those looking at the screen, I just would like you to also be paying attention to not just the dimensions, but the number of colors and the number of plates involved in each of these prints. You started this project in October of 2016, and the proofing, that is up to the point of signing the RTP, extended to December of 2017. And editioning was completed in September of 2020. So I'd like, in Sidney's words, the spirit of Gemini is best captured by the word collaboration. Collaboration has been vital to your work. With Lawrence Chua and Paul Pfeiffer, you've co-founded Denniston Hill. You've also collaborated across creative disciplines with Jason Moran, musician, with Peter Sellers, a theater director, Robin Cost-Lewis, a poet. Most recently, as Mary mentioned, with the designers and engineers of BMW for the 20th art car. Of course, you've also collaborated with visual artists, and most recently with Nairi. And there is the collective, the communal, the collaborative, which is very instructive, very generative, as you said. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how that is particular to Gemini, because you have worked also at other print shops. You mentioned Greg Burnett, Crown Point, Niels Borsche, but you've also had this very enduring relationship with Gemini.
Yeah, and part of that is there's several things. there's several layers. One, you come here, like, and the project can go on for years. So we don't, there's not, it's like at Crown Point, you go and you work for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and you start, you're in the studio every day, and you finish the project, and then you leave. At and it's a really interesting model to work that way, and I really enjoyed that. But the thing with coming here is there's this open-endedness to it. So, like the Bardo project, I didn't know what it was going to be at first. I mean, we ended up getting to the two of the prints being very tall because we were starting with a group of prints. I wanted to have a relationship between them somehow, create a series that they were in conversation, but they each had their own unique thing and their distinct kind of aspect to them. And I didn't know what that would be. The first it was just this kind of open drawing when I came. Well, let's try this. Let's try to make something a little smaller. I mean, we ended up making them taller, but at the beginning, that was the idea. And we worked very loosely with one another, Case and I, and the others on the team. Here you have Oliver and Amy in this image working with us. But Case built this wonderful team of people, these etchers, this group here, who we're still working together today. Like, we started working together in, I don't know when we started Case, it was years ago, but when? No, not when we started, with the whole team. It was like 10, 12, something like that, 14. Yeah, 14. And we're still working together. So 10 years we've been working together as a team. And that's also been, I mean, it's really interesting. It's like each human, it brings a whole base of knowledge and their knowledge, but then also their technology, like their way of kind of developing something. So it's really a collaborative process. On the most recent prints we're working on with color, we have to, I wanted to get this kind of blended, kind of blurry color, kind of atmospheric light in the painting, in the prints. And it was, they figured it out. I thought it was an impossibility. We weren't going to include it. But Isabel and Oliver and Isaac and Case worked together to find a way, and they sent me a proof, and I was like, wait, how did you do that but they built up these great gradients. And so it's this experimentation and this coming together of these different minds, these different talents, and working with one another. And then when they push the envelope that much, then I have to do that. Like, I can't. I have to keep up and then go further. So then I have to do something else. And we work and work and work until we keep proofing. And these take forever. It takes a whole day to pull one of those prints.
Can we show the video now?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Phil, could you play the video? This is a video of Case and his team. You'll see what Julie's talking about. I just want to thank Christopher Sprinkle and Rob King for putting together that video.
It's really cool. Yeah, and Amy, who is no longer part of the team at the moment, is a mother, and she and Isaac had this gorgeous baby girl together a year ago. So that's the first new generation studio baby. See, I mean, so it's also
Very generative.
Yeah, we have to be. But making prints, I mean, you just watch that video, and it's so laborious to do that, to just get some black marks, right? You can just work with a piece of, a brush and ink on white paper and just do that. But there's what happens, the attentiveness to the process and the attention to that detail. They're able to do that, and then they make 30 of these unique works of art that are each carefully crafted, and then the plates are discarded or canceled and thrown out so that you can't whatever, recycled. But these prints become these really, they're really different than a drawing. The way that they look, and they become such important works on their own. And to me, like, they have something that a painting or a drawing just doesn't have. And I think you can really speak to that. I mean, it's what you've chosen to like focus your studies on. And yeah, I think it's remarkable what printmaking can do, and why you put a life into working with this material to do something that's been around for centuries. It's an amazing, amazing technology.
I mean, what's fascinating to me is that the technology of intaglio, basic technology of intaglio printmaking, has really it has expanded, but it is fundamentally the same as it was practiced really starting in the 15th century. And yet we could not be further from the works of the Renaissance when we see, in a formal sense, but in a technological sense, it is very much of a continued lineage. And speaking of lineage, if we could speak briefly about, this incredible history at Gemini of artists coming to work in this space, and what it's like for you to come into the space that's not your own space, although I'm sure now it feels familiar, where there is a remarkable history and legacy of artists who have made prints there. And here you're studying some Gemini editions by Philip Guston, but you're surrounded by the work of artists there. And how, what that dialogue is like for you.
But that's the exhilarating part of this, is that so many of these artists have made these phenomenal prints. How does one keep up? Like, how does one try to even reach that? That's the desire. That's like, so when you're working in that environment, it's exhilarating, and it's definitely intimidating. But it's also, it offers that you can see that things are possible. So I love that aspect of being able to, I love going into the archive at Gemini. I love when they pull prints and show me older prints that you don't see anymore. We just looked yesterday at an incredible print that they pulled, a David Hockney lithograph drawing of Sidney Felsen. Amazing, beautiful, beautiful piece. As well as these amazing Noguchi editions, right? Like, and so there's you can really go and look. I mean, and these Noguchis are in aluminum. They're like they're sculptural editions, and they're also so, there's something that, I don't know. There's something about going into this other space, and all of that psychic energy is there. All of that there's this memory, there's this capability, and I think that's what really can carry us through it, because, I mean, it's always cleaned out. It always looks the same when you go in. There's nobody else's work is around in the artist studio, but there's stuff that's in the artist studio that you've seen in Felsen's photographs, in Sidney's photographs. You've seen them. So you know that Rauschenberg was there, and Rosenquist was there, and Gary was there, and you know this when you're in there. And there's something about being able to be in that environment and wanting to create something that can live at that level. That can. So to me, that's part of the thrill of it, and yeah, the honor.
I just want to respond to that with two comments. First, when going through Sidney's archive of 70,000 images, the bulk being taken at Gemini. And what's extraordinary to me, and for those who've never been to Gemini, it's not a huge space. I mean, the artist studio is not massive, and yet these very large works come forth from this space. But what was really extraordinary to me was to see the way in which the space is completely transformed by each artist. That you would think that you're actually not looking at the same space. There are clues, there are indicators, there's the window, there's that mirror, there are things that tell you, okay, you're in the artist studio, you're at Gemini. But the way in which that space is completely transformed, and artists feel like they can bring themselves fully to that. And to that, I want to also read a quote from Case Hudson, regarding the printer's role, and these are his words. "I think of the printer's role of one of making space, trying to make an ideal space for an artist, mentally and physically, where they can walk in and feel like they can start something new. As a printer, I have to be open, ready for any kind of possibility of what an artist wants to do." And I think that beautifully captures really what Gemini, the whole Gemini family is able to do for artists. The last project I'd like to talk about is Robin's Intimacy, which is your most recent published edition. Again, please note the scale, colors, and number of plates. To me, this is such a printmaker's print. And I say that because it was the same plates, the same 50 plates, were used to print this color edition and then this monochrome edition. It is only in printmaking that color can exist independent of form. So you can make a mark, and that mark can be in any color, and you were talking about that earlier on, about how that creates possibility for you. This is demonstrated beautifully in this incredible tour de force, and I'm going to show also a detail because I think you can see here a little bit better how these are really the exact same plates, but they're just printed in different colors. In antiquity, into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, monochrome and grisaille, or working in a grayscale in particular, was a form of asceticism, and it represented stability and restraint in contrast to the ephemeral distraction of color. I'm interested in the meaning that you attribute to color, because if we see here, we go back, the titles of the works, so the project is Robin's Intimacy, but you have titled the one in monochrome, Treatises on the Executed, whereas the color edition is The Manifestation of Historic Restlessness. I'm hoping you can either talk specifically to these or just what the meaning of color for you and how that brings it kind of brings a new iconography in a way.
Yeah, so when we were working together, I had gone way too far with a drawing once, the prints before this and the bardos. And one of the ways that we were able to resolve that somehow is when we took a bunch of the marks and we made them gold as opposed to black. And then just certain marks in black. And then actually started to creep color into some of the marks with this à la poupée technique, where you can use multiple colors on one plate, as opposed to having a different color for each plate. And so when we realized that we could do this, and it was successful with the bardos, something new happened in that. Well, I was starting to really push with color in the paintings, and in the newer paintings before this, the last couple of years, just preceding this time, before my show at LACMA, I was really pushing with the blurred color backgrounds and marks and color, and trying to think about all of that differently. And so then, when I was installing the show for LACMA, is when I started to work on this. And when we first got the full drawing and we had the first proofs, in my head it was always going to be in color. Like this was just getting the marks down and getting the proofs of what is there. And somehow, when we did that, and we would do the different plates. For example, in this this treatise on the executed, this piece, we did all the color, we did the proofing each plate with a little bit of a different color at that time, just to differentiate which plate was which. But we really liked it. Like somehow something really interesting happened in this, and I like what you say about this aesthetics of
asceticism.
Asceticism, yeah, this kind of restraint and what can happen in that space. But I did definitely want to do what we would with this, play with color and push that. And we wasn't sure if the print would go. We could always go back to the and of course, Sidney, being Sidney, is why don't we do both? Like once we started proofing in color, Sidney was like, you could do two versions. Like we could, and because of that expansive nature that Sidney has, and they kind of push for that. And Case really took it on. We started thinking of each plate with color. I start doing the technique of assigning certain marks, certain colors, and we start going. And it becomes this process with the whole team where we start proofing one piece of paper and another, and then eventually the whole thing. And then that takes a long time, so I'm back in New York, and then I get this proof sent to me in New York, and we put them up in the studio there, and then I'll come back to LA, and we'll work together. And it took a lot of time, but we did it. And COVID interrupted us for a bit, but when we finished, what happens with the color, it becomes a very different kind of landscape. It becomes a very different kind of space. And interestingly, I always title things most of the time when the piece is finished. And I was doing a show with Robin in Paris. These prints were going to be shown for the first time there. And I still hadn't totally figured out what the title was going to be, but one time I was looking at the prints and I had Robin's poem with me that she had written for this show. And for our collaboration, and the piece is called Intimacy, the poem. It's a long, long poem. And these are two lines taken from her poetry. And they seemed, and I wanted both the lines to come from the poetry, but I wanted them to be different. And you saw, in the show, you see everything in twos. You see these echoes constantly. So you saw these two prints in the gallery, one floor above the other. And so the first gallery, you saw the color, and then when you went downstairs, you had the black and white. And there was something about that echoing and about these kind of alternate moments of time that are kind of addressed with the title. And so this really feels like that time, this kind of historic restlessness, right? This kind of, that it felt to me like it carried that in it. And we've been thinking a lot about, the treaties of that line is just such a powerful line, and it felt really appropriate for this one. And they both come from that poem, and they both come from this conversation Robin and I have been having for a long time.
You talked about Sidney's openness and what has brought us together today, what has brought all of us together today is Sidney and his exhibition and his friendship. I would just like to take the last moments of this conversation to talk about Sidney as a photographer. So all of the photos that you've seen of Julie working, those are all photographs that Sidney took. Here we see you, this kind of dynamic scale. And this is Sidney, this is a photograph that Case Hudson took, but you see in the background Sidney in his white trousers and white shoes, photographing you in the Gemini courtyard.
White trousers, white shoes, white hat, fedora, in a studio covered with black ink everywhere.
Yeah.
And not getting a mark on it. Not on the shoe, not on the belt.
Just behind him in that, if you go through that door, was the Richard Serra studio, who printed exclusively in black. I want to read a quote from Tessa Dean, who's a dear friend of yours and another Gemini artist, about Sidney as a photographer. When being photographed, everyone has a degree of self-consciousness. I can't work in front of people. It's another eye in the room and the sense that somebody's watching you. But Sidney's photographs don't have that, because Sidney with a camera becomes part of making a print at Gemini. That intrusive eye is not there at all. That's the beauty of those images. It is a rare insight into artists working.
It's also amazing Tacita saying that, because Tacita does that too. The filming of artists.
Yes. This is, I think, a very good example of that intrusive eye not being there. He's there in this artist studio, which, as I said, is not a very large space. He's very close to you as you're working. I'd love for you to talk about the experience of being a subject of Sidney's photography.
I mean, he's he always asks. He comes in and he says, "Would it be okay if I took some photographs now?" And I'm always, of course. But the reason is that even if he's not taking photographs, he's sitting in the studio in his office, which is right next to the artist studio, and the door is usually open. I leave the door open most of the time unless they're having a meeting or something. And so you're always together somehow working. That's the experience, like what Tass says about coming to Gemini. But there is something very unintrusive about the way Sidney operates when he's with the camera and he's in there taking pictures. What's wonderful is that he takes pictures a lot. Like, it's not just in the studio, it's outside of the studio. It's when you're pulling away in the convertible that he's rented you for your time in LA, or, you know, when you're out to dinner at some amazing restaurant he's taken you all to while you're here with all your friends. I mean, the kind of generosity of spirit, generosity of soul, he's taught me more, he's really taught me how to live a life. And how to live with really an incredible kind of, he's just an amazing, amazing human being. And I just feel so lucky to have had the experience of having him in my life. But I just feel like, again, the honor of the history of the artists he's photographed and worked with. And, you know, we've developed a very close friendship, and it just has never felt at all like, it's really intense. Gemini's always felt like a retreat. It's kind of felt like this place where when I come to LA, I'm outside of my life. I'm able to, like, you know, get deep into a new project of work. I'm working with this amazing team. And, you know, I usually leave late. I'm there. They usually work late with me. And, you know, we have dinners. I stay in a nice hotel nearby. And it's always like there's something about this respite, this type of, like, pause in the process of painting, in the process of being at home with my children and everything in life, and getting lost in this other project. And there's the way that the Gemini, Sidney, the entire team there, Joni, Suzanne, all of the whole Grinstein family, the whole Felsen family, the way that, and Carmelita and the others, in addition to Case and Javier and the others, but the team and the kind of family of Gemini, how they nurture and shepherd you into making new works of art is extraordinary. It's there's something like it's like a Moses kind of situation, and I mean that in this way of kind of helping something come to life and be born. So we both want to dedicate this talk to Sidney and to Sidney's incredible gift of each other, of friends and family, and this incredible project that continues to go, is generating incredible work each day. I mean, this Tobacadori, you have to see it. Like, it's an amazing print, and they have many new things coming out, but I'm not trying to just be a Gemini kind of supporter, but it's really such a unique such a treasure that you have here in Los Angeles.
Julie, I want to thank you for your generosity, and I mean that in all senses. And this has really been, like with all conversations, it's a matter of trying to keep pace with you, and, you know, this really prodigious mind and very incisive critical thinking that you bring to everything that you do. I would like to.
That's really, that's your, that's you. But thank you.
I just want to close by reading Julie's words about Sidney. One of the most incredible things I have learned from Gemini is what can be possible through printmaking and how that can help shift and challenge painting. Deeper than that was a way of life that Sidney taught me: how to love, how to enjoy life, how to work hard, and how to live that whole life with a form of grace. Thank you so much, Sidney.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.